what I found myself thinking about while I was skinning all of those defrosted bananas is how regularly we do things that are kind of unappetizing in order to make food, and how engaging with kind of repulsive or mildly repulsive activities seems to contribute to the process of making good food in many ways. I was thinking about it because the bananas, when they're defrosted and they're slimy, and it's, even though they smell good, and I know that they're going to become something really good, they kind of act as kind of disgusting. I mean, they smell really strong as well, which kind of contributes to it, but I was thinking about the first time I worked with raw meat as a kid, or at least the first time that I remember handling raw meat as a kid. It wasn't at home, it was at school. I went to grade school in Regina, this inner city school called Herkimer. It doesn't exist anymore. But what we were doing, or what we did that day, is we had a guest for some reason who brought caribou. So it's raw, it's dark meat, especially because it's a game meat. It has quite a strong smell. And even as a kid, I remember liking game meat, and I don't know why I would have had it. Possibly my brother-in-law, but so it wasn't that I didn't like it, but somehow if you have any familiarity with preparing raw meat, it's always a more kind of extreme version of whatever the smell or taste is raw. And it smelled so powerful. But it was also, I think still as an adult, I can remember the flavor, and it wasn't, I don't think we did anything very special to it. It was like salt and pepper, and then I think like broiled in little strips in the oven. And I still remember that taste as being one of the kind of best tasting meats I've ever had in my life. And I thought that at the time as well. As a kid, and I probably would have been like 10, maybe 8. I could have even been younger than that. I don't remember much else, but I remember how repulsive the smell was when we were handling it raw, and the smell like stuck to your hand. Just like the kind of bloody, gamey smell. I mean, mashing up bananas with your hands is no real comparison. The kind of the smell of blood is, I think, a little bit different than the smell of an overripe banana. But Yeah, there's no real comparison. But, I mean, I remember mixing up meatloaf or the first time I ever prepared chicken, and you think of chicken as being kind of the least offensive kind of meat, or at least I do. And even chicken, when it's raw, has this kind of repulsive scent to it. And yet, I think it's pretty hard to find somebody who doesn't like eating chicken. I mean, they might like or dislike kind of poorly prepared chicken, or find it boring, but they don't find it repulsive or too strong or whatever. Wait, no, I need one more. But regularly, you know, if you're cooking anything from scratch, there's going to be some point where what you're making is kind of gross or just not appetizing. You know, raw eggs, for most people, aren't terribly appetizing. Things like cheese. I mean, fermentation is kind of its whole other thing, but, you know, if you start out making bread with sourdough, there can be a point where the starter that you've been feeding, so the culture, has flour and water added to it every day until it kind of becomes stable. There's usually a point somewhere in that process where it smells like nothing anyone could ever eat. And I remember that happening where I thought, when it's done, like there's no coming back from this. It just seems so, I mean, it smelled like poison, you know, it just smells rotten. And then somehow it comes back from that point and it becomes something delicious. But I think, you know, you think about the amount of people who eat meat and whether they're involved in preparing it in any way or not. You know, we're pretty separate from how it becomes meat. You know, the kind of process of turning an animal into a meat product is pretty foreign to most people, myself included. And I think to the point that it's almost like a cliche thing to talk about, like, oh, if you don't think you can kill that animal, you shouldn't be eating it, kind of thing. But I think that kind of attitude is extended further into other things as well, not just meat, but I think even the idea of, you know, something fairly pedestrian being cooked and still having to engage with it, like mashing the bananas by hand, or you know, fermenting something from scratch, or even things like having to gut a pumpkin and feeling the kind of the sliminess, or I think it happens a lot when the kind of desperation with which we avoid rot of any kind. And I think about, and I still do this because my mom did it, but just like, you know, not throwing things out on the day that they say they're best before. There's a lot of paranoia about those kinds of things, and you know, sometimes they don't smell as good, or they don't look as good, or there's mold, or there's discoloration, and you know, we avoid those things like the plague, I guess. It's kind of a pun, but there's an aspect of horror that I think is totally inappropriate and extreme. Like, you know, a piece of rotten fruit is not horrifying. A bit of mold on your bread is not horrifying. And then depending on who you are, maybe meat isn't horrifying either, but it's totally dependent on your outlook on life. Certainly to many people who are engaged with their own meat production, it's not horrifying, but somehow it seems unhealthy to kind of remove ourselves from that horror. I don't just think it's classism either, although that's certainly a part of it. You know, if you're the wealthy monarch, you don't have to separate your own eggs or there's like a baseness or a visceral quality to dealing with the just kind of reality of the nature of your own food. And kind of removing ourselves step by step until even something like mashing up a banana is repulsive, I think it's really unhealthy. It's kind of based on having the luxury of having a delicate sensibility, maybe, or something like it. And when I say that, I'm not talking about meat. I think it's perfectly acceptable for someone to be horrified by meat and, you know, physically and morally, and choose not to engage with it. But I suppose part of it is the illusion that we can civilize food. Maybe baking is a pretty civilized activity, but fermentation is just kind of the hijacking of a natural process. It's rot. I mean, that's what would be happening on the ground and in the soil, but just kind of arrested and controlled by human hands. And I think if you engage in fermentation at all, if you watch it happening, if you do it on purpose or not on purpose, you can't kind of deny that there's something natural happening that isn't under your control. Or maybe that's it. Maybe it's about not losing that idea that maybe we don't have as much control as we think we do. I mean, when you're making your own food, the closer you get to the source of that food, you know, not talking about like pouring different things out of bags into a different container or warming something up in the microwave, but like the closer you get to the real thing, growing food or hunting food, or I think the more you realize how much has to happen before it gets to you or before it can benefit you, you kind of realize, like, the more control you take, the more you realize how little control you actually have. But I don't think that you have to, like, forage and hunt and grow everything to be a part of that process. I mean, I think that's an unreasonable expectation to put on people or on yourself. I mean, the fact of the matter is that we don't live in a society that really enables that much. And you have to find the ways that are accessible to you to still engage with it. And I think even things like, you know, not, I guess it's more like finding ways not to be wasteful. Engaging with the natural trajectory of the food we rely on. And I think that's something I've been working on a lot, because I think I'm pretty normal in that, you know, as an individual and in my family. There's always, like, contending with how much we buy versus how much we throw out is like an ongoing challenge. I think it's inevitable that there's always going to be some waste, especially when you can never predict certain things. Certain things are always going to be unpredictable. But trying to mitigate that by being more kind of mindful. And that what I'm doing right now is created by a desire not to waste something. You know, you have bananas that are inedible. Well, I mean, they're not inedible, but they're no longer pleasant to eat fresh. So you can throw them in the freezer and then, you know, one at a time for however long, and then once you have a certain amount, it's like you have enough to make bread, and that's one way of making sure that those 6 bananas, 8 bananas, whatever, don't end up just in the garbage. And I think, you know, there is no illusion that these are the best bananas or the best quality. It's like the food gains its characteristic from the food being the bread, gains its characteristic kind of flavor and scent from the fact that the bananas aren't at their peak. So that fact that they're not at their best is kind of a part of what makes it so good. I think we used to think of that, at least when I was a kid, we thought of it as like saving money. And I think a lot of, well, no, that's not true. A lot of people think of it as kind of a saving money thing. But the truth is that for most people, it's not really about that anymore. And, you know, you might be able to buy just banana bread at the store for cheaper than you could buy a bag of flour, a bag of sugar, and a few bananas. You know, it might actually be cheaper, especially if you factored in the time required. I think what is happening, and should keep happening probably, is the realization that we don't have, even if we don't have to do these things to save money, that waste or wastefulness is about more than money, that things can have a value beyond how much money we're spending or not spending, and that not being wasteful serves purposes beyond not spending money. Because whether we buy them or not, or whether we waste them or not, the water and the land and labor required to make those bananas have still been spent. That value is a part of the product whether we put it there or not. And it's worth recognizing, I think. I think it's easy to forget. Now, anyway.